The Drifter's Visit by Jason Wilde. The sun had just begun to rise over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting golden hues across the rows of identical houses. In one of these homes, Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, her swollen belly resting comfortably on her lap as she cradled a cup of tea. She gazed out the window, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. Mark, her husband, was standing by the counter, holding a mug of coffee and staring absently at the clock. "I think I'm going to call in sick today," Mark said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Claire raised her eyebrows, surprised. "You? Call in sick? You've never missed a day of work in your life. What's up?" Mark shrugged, turning his gaze to the window. "I don't know. I just feel like I shouldn't go in today. Something feels off." Claire followed his gaze out the window, where a man was walking slowly down the street. He was older, perhaps in his 70s, wearing clothes that looked well worn, but not dirty. There was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that caught Claire's attention too. "Do you think he's okay?" she asked quietly. "He looks like he's been walking for miles." Mark nodded, his eyes narrowing as he watched the man pause in front of their house. The man glanced up at the sky, then down at his feet, as if contemplating whether to keep going. There was a certain sadness about him, but also something more, a sense of purpose, as if he had come here for a reason. "I'm going to ask him in," Mark said. Claire didn't protest. There was something about the man that made her feel safe. Oddly enough, it felt like he belonged here, like he was supposed to be in their home today, even though they had never seen him before. Mark opened the front door and called out to the man, "Hey there, you look like you could use a break. Why don't you come in and have some coffee?" The man hesitated, looking up with surprise in his eyes. For a moment, he seemed to consider declining the offer, but then his expression softened, and he nodded. Slowly he made his way up the driveway and into the house. "I'm John," the man said as he stepped inside, offering a handshake to Mark. His grip was firm but gentle, and his voice had a richness to it, like someone who had spent years thinking deeply about life. "My name's Mark, and this is my wife Claire," Mark replied. "Well, nice to meet you," Claire said with a warm smile. "Please, sit down. Would you like some coffee?" John nodded gratefully. "That would be wonderful. Thank you." As Claire poured the coffee, she noticed the way John was looking around the house, taking in every detail as if he were committing it to memory. His eyes lingered on the photographs on the wall, the ones of Mark and Claire on their wedding day, the ultrasound photo of their soon-to-arrive baby, the family portraits with their parents. There was a softness in his gaze, almost as if he knew these people. But that was impossible. "You've got a beautiful home," John said quietly, his voice filled with something like nostalgia. "And congratulations, by the way. You two must be over the moon about this baby." "Thanks," Claire said, smiling as she sat down across from him. "We are, but we're also kind of terrified. It's our first, and we have no idea what we're doing." John chuckled softly, the sound of it almost bittersweet. "No one ever does," he said, "but you'll figure it out. The important thing is to be there for them, to love them, no matter what." Mark leaned forward, intrigued by the drifter's words. "You sound like someone who's speaking from experience. Do you have kids of your own?" There was a pause, just long enough to make it seem like John was choosing his words carefully. "I did," he said. Finally, his voice quieter now. "But I never got the chance to tell them everything I wanted to say. Life has a way of taking people before you're ready." Claire and Mark exchanged a glance. There was something in John's tone that made them feel like he was talking about more than just his own family. It felt personal, like a loss he had carried with him for a long, long time. "I'm sorry," Claire said softly. "It must have been very hard." John nodded, but didn't say anything more about it. Instead, he turned the conversation back to them, asking about their plans for the future and what they hoped for their child, how they were preparing for their life that was about to change completely. As they talked, hours passed without them realizing it. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. John listened intently to everything they said, offering bits of wisdom here and there, simple yet profound. He spoke of the importance of patience, of understanding, of letting children find their own way, while always being there to catch them when they fall. "You'll be great parents," John said at one point, his gaze fixed on Claire's belly. "You'll give that child everything they need, and when the time comes, they'll know how much you love them." Claire smiled, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to John's words. He spoke as if he knew their future, as if he had already seen the child they would raise, and knew the person they would become. "Well, I hope so," Claire said, her voice filled with emotion. I want to do right by them." "You will," John said firmly. "You already are." So as the afternoon stretched on, the conversation shifted to more philosophical topics. John spoke about life and death, about the passage of time, and the importance of gratitude. He seemed to have a deep appreciation for the little things, moments that most people would overlook, but that to him seemed to hold immense significance. "Gratitude," he said softly, "is the most important thing in life. Being thankful for the people who shaped you, who loved you, who made you who you are. That's what keeps their memory alive, even when they're gone." There was a faraway look in his eyes, as he said this, and for a moment, Claire wondered if he was talking about someone in particular, someone he had lost. "Do you still think about them?" she asked gently. "Your parents, I mean." John's smile was sad, but full of warmth. "Every day," he said. "I never got a chance to thank them properly. I never told them how much they meant to me, how much they did for me. I always thought there would be time, but life has a way of surprising you." Mark and Claire both fell silent, sensing the depth of emotion behind John's words. There was something about him, something that made them feel like he was sharing a part of himself that he rarely showed to anyone. And yet, despite the sadness in his voice, there was also peace, as if he had come to terms with the loss a long time ago. So as the day wore on, the three of them moved from the kitchen into the living room, where they continued talking as the sun began to set outside. Claire and Mark shared stories about their own families, about the kind of upbringing they wanted to give their child, and about the hopes they had for the future. John listened quietly, nodding along, but he never offered much about his own past. Whenever they asked him about where he came from, or what his life had been like, he would smile and give a vague answer, deflecting the questions with philosophical musings about life's unpredictability. "I've seen a lot in my time," he said at one point, his eyes twinkling with something like amusement. "But there's one thing I've learned. It's that the future is never set in stone. You can plan all you want, but life has a way of throwing you curveballs." "Well, tell me about it," Mark said with a laugh. "We thought we'd have a few more years before starting a family, and now look at us." John's smile widened, but he said nothing, only nodding in understanding. And as the evening drew to a close, John stood up from his chair, signaling that it was time for him to leave. "Thank you for today," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've given me more than you can possibly know." Mark and Claire both stood as well, not quite ready to see him go. "Are you sure you don't want to stay for dinner?" Claire asked. "We'd love to have you." John shook his head. "I've taken up enough of your time," he said, "but I'll carry this day with me for the rest of my life." As he walked towards the door, Mark felt a sudden urge to stop him, to ask him one last question, something that had been gnawing at the back of his mind all day. But before he could say anything, John turned to them one last time. "Take care of each other," he said softly, "and take care of that little one. They're going to do great things." There was something in his voice, something that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. As John stood at the door, a soft smile crept across his face. His eyes filled with a deep sense of knowing. He had seen this moment before, lived it in a way, and he couldn't help but feel the tug of gratitude as he looked at Mark and Claire for what might be the last time. "Take care of each other," John said softly, his voice steady but carrying the weight of time. "And take care of that little one. They're going to do great things." There was something in his tone, something that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. She felt it again, that nagging feeling that John was more than he appeared, more than just a drifter passing through. Mark, too, seemed caught in the moment, his brow furrowed in confusion. The words were simple enough, yet they felt loaded with meaning, like a riddle left unsolved. John looked at them both, his eyes lingering on Claire's belly. "You've already started on the right path," he added, his voice growing softer. "You'll give them everything they need." As he turned to leave, Mark finally spoke up. "John?" he called out, his voice hesitant. Who are you really?" John paused at the door, his hand resting on the knob. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders seemed to sag just a bit, as if the weight of the answer was too much to bear. For a moment, it looked as though he might say something, reveal the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface all day. But instead, he just smiled. "Someone who owes you more than you'll ever know," John said softly. And with that, he opened the door and stepped out into the cool evening air. Claire and Mark watched as he walked away, his figure growing smaller in the fading light. They stood in silence for a long time, the weight of the day settling over them like a blanket. When they finally closed the door and sat back down in the living room, the house felt different, quieter, almost hollow, as if something important had just left. Mark glanced at Claire, his thoughts racing. "Do you think—" He didn't finish the sentence, unsure of what he was even asking. Claire shook her head, but there was uncertainty in her eyes. No, she said softly. "That's crazy, right?" But the thought lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. They had both felt it. Some deeper connection. Something more than coincidence in John's visit. And as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Claire and Mark would often find themselves thinking back to that strange day with the drifter. They never spoke about it openly, as if acknowledging the mystery might somehow unravel it, but it remained with them, tucked away in the corners of their minds. And when their son was born, a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and curious eyes, there was a moment, fleeting but powerful, when they both remembered John's words. "He's going to do great things," Claire whispered to herself as she cradled her newborn son in her arms. And Just for a moment, she swore she could see a shadowy figure in the doorway, watching them with quiet satisfaction before disappearing into the ether. Somewhere, in a time they could not reach, John smiled to himself, his heart finally at peace. Good night and namaste.